And good morning. I'm here with my good friend Paul Thomas. He's about to be a featured speaker at LitCon. So I'm going to stop talking right now and let Paul tell you first a little bit about himself and then a little bit about what things he might be talking about at LitCon. So, Paul, take it over.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for having me on. I'm Paul Thomas. I am a professor of education at Furman University. And excuse me, I've been there for about 20 years. And before that, I was a high school English teacher. And I've been doing a lot of work on reading and the science of reading for several years now, probably about when it started in 2018. I also have a book on the science of reading movement, which the second edition should be coming out in just a few weeks. Did the final proofs just recently. I also just completed a policy brief for NEPC, National Education Policy Center in Boulder, Colorado, at University of Colorado. And so I've been spending a lot of time this summer working on policy. And my intentions are when LitCon rolls around in 2023, I'll probably still be focusing on the policy aspect. So I've been really trying to work on how to communicate the problems with the science of reading movement to policymakers, but also offer some alternatives to those, what I would say, misunderstandings.
This is a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about next. First, I'm hoping we'll get links from you to both of those things. And it's really exciting that you've got the new book coming out. And the other then is um, just tell us a little bit about what you might say as someone trying to defend reading recovery and other constructivist ideas that are under attack all the time. What kinds of things you might say to policymakers, and let's just hear what you have to say about that.
I think the most important thing to start with is sort of the history of reading crises and how they're very similar. So one thing that I've been doing, I do in my book and I also do in the policy brief, is outline, 1940s, we had a reading crisis around literacy rates of people who were drafted into World War II. In the 1950s and 60s, it was the, why Johnny can't read movement. And then, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we have the rise of whole language. And by the 1990s, we're blaming whole language for lower test scores, specifically like in California. And then I think the big turning point, probably the one that's most important to us, is the National Reading Panel became part of No Child Left Behind. And instead of solving our problem, I think it created a pretty big reading crisis, people debating the panel itself and especially their subgroup findings, the ones on phonics. And I'm actually working on a white paper for Ohio Education Association right now that's focusing on grade retention. And the point that I make early in it is it's barely been 2 decades since federal legislation said that reading instruction had to be scientifically based. And oddly enough, we're shouting, or some people are shouting, that we're not using the science of reading and that there's another reading crisis, which is a little frustrating, but I think a good bit ironic. So throughout all of those phases, we basically said the same thing, that classroom practice is too often absent phonics instruction, and the solution is phonics instruction. That was never true. What I find pretty fascinating is in 1940s, there was a special issue of the NCTE, National Council of Teachers of English, their primary journal. Now it's called Elementary English. or excuse me, now it's called language arts. It was called elementary English then. But the scholars in the 40s said, wait a minute, students are getting phonics instruction, but the problem with reading achievement is poverty. And those of us who have been saying that it's out of school factors have been ignored ever since. You know, that's 80 years of us shouting the same thing. So one thing that I would ask policymakers to do, and one thing I'll talk about in my LitCon presentation, is to think differently about reading policy. And also to recognize that any changes we make within schools is unlikely to be effective if we don't do anything about social inequity. One thing I try to say all the time is if students are sick or hungry or have insecurity about where they're living, they don't know where they're going to sleep from one day to the other, they have a legitimate reason not to focus on school and literacy. Given the opportunity, giving those students better lives, I think we would automatically see an increase in reading achievement and even them wanting to read. So that's a lot of what I will focus on, and we're very, very fortunate. There are two special issues of Reading Research Quarterly that extensively address what what we know about reading. Also specifically addresses the science of reading movement. And the problem I think for us is that these are scholars and very few people have access to these journals. So a lot of my work is, especially the policy brief, I'm going to make all of that information accessible to everyone. So the policy brief from NEPC will be online. Anyone can get it. And I include references to probably dozens of those scholarly articles, as well as we have a lot of research from England. We have a lot of research from overseas that complicates and mostly, I would say, refutes a lot of what we're saying about reading and how reading should be taught.
Okay, if I could, I'm familiar with a great deal of what you said, but I want to make sure that my readers are as well. And there's two huge points there that you made, and I want to make sure that my readers are very aware. The first is the impact of that retention policy, a little bit of the history of that, and what happens. I I'll let you do the talking on that, but it's simply so wrong. And of course, NSET was opposed to that kind of a thing from the get go. Uh, I think the other thing is the whole business of England. And I think if you look at England today, you might actually be seeing the future of the United States. And the fact of the matter is that in England, we've had a long, long stint of synthetic phonics and that kind of thing, and yet no real results. I'd like for you to talk about both of those things in turn.
Yeah, so what I think is really important to understand about grade retention, I'd say I think there's three things we should know about grade retention. It's sort of the Florida model. This happened right after the National Reading Panel and No Child Left Behind in the 2000s. Florida started aggressively retaining students. So here is one fact. Grade retention policies have been correlated with short-term gains in standardized test scores of reading. But we have to understand, when you retain students, you remove the population of students most likely to score low from the testing pool. And then once those students have been retained and they move on to the next grade, you're adding to the testing pool students who are biologically 1 year older than the test pool. So while it's true that you can raise scores in the short term, I call that a mirage. It's a statistical mirage. The research also shows that by middle school, those gains are gone, which is incredibly important to understand. So it's short-term gains that are likely a mirage that disappear over time. The final point that I think we have to, or the second point that I think we have to emphasize, is that grade retention is still strongly correlated with dropping out of school. So grade retention is harmful. It may or may not be helping raise test scores. And those two things, cannot be ignored. A final point is grade retention disproportionately punishes vulnerable populations of students. Just as an example on some work that I'm doing right now, 70+% of students retained in Mississippi, and that in 2017, 2018, Mississippi retained over 1,000 students. Disproportionately, 70% plus of those were Black. In Ohio, which in that same time period retained 1,888 students, over 50% were Black. That is the key problem. Grade retention is punitive. It's a punishment. It isn't necessarily what is causing these short-term gains. It could be the other policies connected with grade retention. Researchers have looked at it, and there is no way to say that the grade retention is causing it. But I think the inequity of grade retention, the harm of grade retention, clearly shows that we shouldn't be using it as reading policy. And what was the second thing you wanted?
Okay, the second thing is about looking at England and what hasn't
Oh,
happened.
sorry. Yeah.
I have a goodly number of followers and friends in England, and I keep awaiting hearing that, oh, all is solved because we've had all these years of synthetic phonics, and the fact of the matter is, nothing has been solved. But now I'm stealing your thunder, so I'll let you take over.
Right. So there's a really good study since 2006. England has mandated systematic phonics for all students, and they focus on synthetic phonics. And not to get too deep into the weeds, but there's multiple competing ways to teach phonics. There's actually some research that synthetic phonics is not the best way to do it, although that's the one England chose. So the study says that in 2006, the policy changed. In 2014, there was an update to it. Excuse me. And then one thing that it found is these policies did change classroom practice. So I think it's really important to recognize when policy does change classroom practice, we get a better idea of if it's effective or not. The analysis found that students are doing no better in reading proficiency now than they were before the policy change. But really important, and there's kind of irony to the conclusion, a balanced approach to instruction was found to be more effective than systematic phonics for all students. I think this is really important to understand. Joe Bowers, it might be Jeff Bowers, has a study that came out a little bit before this that also found that direct phonics instruction is no better and no worse than what we would call whole language instruction. So one thing we can conclude is that if you adopt policy, you can change classroom practice, but if you pick the wrong policies, that you're not going to get the outcomes that you promise.
Okay, and just one last question, then I'll kind of throw it open to any final thoughts. And that one has to do with California and whole language and what actually happened there. Whole language got blamed for failing scores, and yet I think what you just said a moment ago about policy and changing what teachers actually are doing is relevant, and I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, the whole language collapse of the 1990s is pretty fascinating. I think there's several things we should understand about it. Regi Routman and Stephen Krashen both pointed out a couple of things that are very important. One, even though whole language was the sort of the official philosophy of California, there's good evidence that it did not change practice. So this is much different than the study that came out of England. It appears that teachers went in their classrooms and still practiced whatever they wanted to. They weren't necessarily doing whole language. Now, more important, I think, is did test scores drop in California in reading? Yes. What happened during that time are two things. California greatly reduced funding for schools, and there was a huge influx of high poverty second language learners into the testing pool, which the evidence suggests that the drop in test scores had more to do with lack of funding and changing the pool of students who struggle with literacy.
Okay, so um, a lot of fascinating stuff here. I can't wait to get links available for the white paper. I don't know how soon that will happen. And of course, the new addition to your book, can't wait for that to happen. Um, so, any other final thoughts here? I'm sure that the people at LitCon are going to be um, very interested in everything you have to say. But any other final thoughts before we sign off?
I'm hoping the grade retention white paper, we're going to be working on that this month. So I'm saying by the beginning of September, I'll probably be able to share. The Ohio Education Association will be using it, but I've got permission to share it also. I'm saying the next couple of weeks, the policy brief will be coming out with NEPC. And again, I will make that link available and anyone can access that. There's no paywall for the NEPC briefs, which I think is wonderful. And I would just say that, I think we've got to be diligent. Education Week, who has been on the science of reading bandwagon since the beginning, just had an article out, and way over 30 states now have revised or started new reading legislation since 2013, and over 20 of those include grade retention, and this is just increasing. This is not going to slow down. So this is, a real problem. I would like to put a plug out that, the Ohio Education Association is making a concerted effort here in the next couple of months to get grade retention taken out of policy in Ohio, and I hope more places will do that also.
Well, I certainly share that hope. You are certainly a strong and wonderful voice for literacy in the United States, and a great source of information on the broad perspective of things. Okay, so as you well know, I have a silly thing that I do at the end of every interview, and that is our Zoom wave goodbye. So if you can indulge me and just give us a wave. Okay, thank you so much.